The video that you are about to see is one of a three-part video series that I have here on my YouTube channel. It's essentially an HSP 101 mini course that I've created. There's one all about the highly sensitive trait, there's one about the highly sensitive brain, and then I made another one all about how to have a healthy mindset around being a highly sensitive person. So make sure to check out the other two videos if you're interested as well. All three of these videos are actually course modules that I've taken directly out of my online program that I've built for highly sensitive people to help guide them from a survival state to a thriving state in their health, relationships, and career. There are over 160 video modules at this point in this course, all on numerous topics such as boundary setting, how to get quality sleep, self-care, relationships, your career as a highly sensitive person, and so much more. I'm Tiara Ariel, a highly sensitive person myself and a certified coach, and I've been educating myself for several years now on the highly sensitive trait, the nervous system, psychology, the subconscious mind, healthy relationship dynamics, holistic wellness, as well as working with real-life HSPs in my coaching practice. And with all of this knowledge that I've accumulated, as well as pulling from my own life experience as a sensitive person, healing myself, and building my dream life, I create content for highly sensitive people who are determined to thrive. So if you fit that description, I hope you will become a subscriber if you're not already and join the movement of highly sensitive people who are reclaiming their lives, becoming their own sources of strength, and stepping into their power. And if you're interested in learning more about my online program for highly sensitive people, where this video series is being pulled from, you can visit my website links in the description. My goal is to help as many highly sensitive people as I can build a life for themselves that is authentically supportive and fulfilling, and to help them believe that that is in fact possible, that they are worthy of it, and that it is safe to step into that vision for themselves. I hope this HSP 101 video series helps you better understand yourself as a highly sensitive person, feel a sense of empowerment, and helps you renew and strengthen any shaky belief that you may have about whether or not it's actually possible to thrive as a highly sensitive person. Okay, let's dive into part 2, all about HSPs, the HSP brain. Let's talk about the unique ways that our HSP brain operates. These are some of the key things that make us who we are as highly sensitive people. I know science and psychology might not be a lot of people's thing, but this information is incredibly relevant to your self-understanding as a highly sensitive person. And this might be the most meta thing that your highly sensitive brain can do. Learn about the highly sensitive brain. It's very plausible that your mind might feel like it's imploding while learning and processing so much information about itself. If at any point you start to feel confused or overwhelmed with fuzzy or foggy brain and having a hard time concentrating, pause the module and let it all sink in, and come back to it after you've given your brain a break. I also just want to say that normally when I use references for these modules for you all, I'll typically paraphrase sources and not rely heavily on direct quotes. But in the case of this module, this information on the HSP brain is fairly scientific. And for the sake of wanting to make sure I give you accurate information, I will be relying on quoting several articles and research studies. It's important I use the right wording for some of these things, because when it comes to science, if you phrase something slightly differently, the entire meaning can change and no longer be accurate. Alright, with all that said, let's get started. One of the key characteristics of highly sensitive people is their natural ability to notice things in their surroundings. This is because our brains are built to pick up on subtleties in our environments and do so with speedy responsiveness. Studies have shown that when those with high sensory processing sensitivity are shown two photographs with a feature changed from one to the other, they have higher reaction times and increased activation in areas involved with visual processing and attention than those lower on the SPS scale, most notably when the change between the two images is subtle. Attention to detail and subtleties is one of the more notable qualities of being a highly sensitive person. But there are plenty of other things that our brains are built to do as well. So let's dive deep into the brain and talk about some of these differences. So what makes an HSP brain an HSP brain? Sensory processing sensitivity is characterized by a hypersensitive brain, reflected by heightened reactivity of the areas indicated in response to social, emotional, or other environmental stimuli. Because of this heightened social emotional awareness and attention to our environment, the HSP brain may be the most powerful social machine in the known universe. There have been several studies done that show us that our brains as highly sensitive people act differently than non-HSPs. especially in certain regions that have to do with empathy and processing emotions of others, and deeply processing and noticing subtle information, but also areas that have to do with self-awareness, reflective thinking and information integration, decision-making, learning, attention and action planning, emotional memory, moment-to-moment awareness, and much more. These areas show an increased activation compared to non-HSPs. And by increased activation, that you can essentially think of as meaning more active, as in it's doing more stuff, lighting up more, or is busier. The main areas that light up more are the insula, the amygdala, and our mirror neurons, which I'll talk about more here in a minute. There are also a couple of areas that don't necessarily have more activation, but just act differently in other ways. These are our serotonin and dopamine systems, which I'll also go over. There is a lot we have yet to learn about the highly sensitive mind, and there is still research being done on the subject as I make this for you, but I want to give you as thorough of an understanding as I can of where the research stands as of now, of what makes our brains unique, because I think it will bring an added layer of self-understanding for you. So let's talk about the first area of the brain with increased activation, the insula. The insula is an important area of their brain that is thought to have a wide variety of functions, and still scientists don't completely know and understand all of what this part of our brain truly does. We do know that it plays a role in things like our moment-to-moment consciousness, our self-awareness, perception, and cognition, understanding our social emotions, tuning into our own bodily sensations, and so much more. This is the region of the brain that lets you know when you are hungry, cold, tired, etc. Several websites mention it to be a brain region that has been long neglected and is poorly understood, but we do know from studies involving the highly sensitive brain that we as HSPs have more brain activation in this area, especially in the cases of observing other people who are experiencing emotions or displaying social cues. In her author's note to the highly sensitive person, Dr. Elaine Aron says, if we, HSPs, are more aware of what is going around inside and outside, the higher activation in the insula during the brain scans, would be exactly the result one would expect. I even found a psychologist on YouTube named Jennifer Sweeten that went into detail about the insula, not necessarily mentioning the HSP trait, but talking about how people with a highly active insula often report being able to pick up on incredibly subtle sensations in their own body. And if this overly active insula is also paired with an overly active amygdala, this ability to tune in can turn into a hyper-awareness of and preoccupation with all of these bodily sensations, and can result in developing anxiety about them. I personally wanted to mention this to you just in case it resonated, because it 100% resonated with me when I first heard this. And this YouTube video, by the way, will be listed in the resources at the end of this presentation, if you're interested in learning more about this specific overly active insula paired with an overly active amygdala. And speaking of the amygdala, let's talk about this next. So the amygdala is the part of the brain that detects danger and alerts the body to take action. Anytime our senses detect something that could be potentially threatening, that information is sent to our amygdala before it is sent to the rest of the brain, where it can be made sense of. This means that human beings, HSP and non-HSPs, are wired to respond to threats first and then conceptualize them after. This is an important survival mechanism, to prioritize protecting ourselves before we stop to make sense of what's happening. HSPs are known to startle more easily because we have a sensitive nervous system detecting small sensory information changes in our environment. But I also wonder if this partially has to do with HSPs having amygdalas that show more brain activity when presented with disturbing or emotionally provocative images. Not only do we startle more easily, but we may also be more jumpy in response to threats, being more fearful and/or more easily triggered to take action and switch into fight or flight mode. We also have stronger connections between areas of the brain that associate emotions to what we are experiencing, which in turn helps us learn more effectively. This high alert threat detection system, keen observation within our own environment, and readiness to jump into fight or flight mode all keep in tone with our evolutionary function, to be the ones who can detect danger at the first subtle indication of it within our environment, so that we can act and alert the others. As you can imagine, this would have been an incredibly helpful skill set to have when we were living in tribes and living in the wilderness. And it's still a valuable set of survival skills to have, and we wouldn't still have them from an evolutionary standpoint if they weren't still serving a good purpose. That's what natural selection does, continue to pass on genes over time that are useful. But this does mean we may have a tendency to feel on edge a lot of the time, and it means we have to learn how to regulate our nervous system, soothe our stress response, and stay grounded and calm our minds in order to counteract this tendency towards hypervigilance. Studies have shown that while some of these brain areas in HSPs may be ramped up more easily, things like meditation access the same areas of the brain and have a calming and soothing effect. So we can train ourselves so that we can utilize our sensitive skill sets while still remaining grounded and calm and keeping chronic stress at bay if we make things like meditation a regular practice. All meditation types show deactivation of the amygdala. This is quoted from a research study done on the highly sensitive brain. Thus, any of these techniques may be useful for the enhancement of self-control and diminished emotional reactivity. Now let's go over the mirror neurons. This is the final area of the brain that I listed that has more brain activation in HSPs. Dr. Elaine Aron does such a good job explaining this in her author's note in the book The Highly Sensitive Person that I just have to read it to you. When there was emotion in the photo during this research study, sensitive persons showed increased activation in the insula, but also more activity in their mirror neuron system, which, by the way, means more active, not necessarily that we have more of them, okay? And this was the case especially when looking at happy faces of loved ones. The brain's mirror neurons were only discovered in the last 20 years or so. When we are watching someone else do something or feel something, this clump of neurons fires in the same way as some of the neurons in the person we are observing. As an example, the same neurons fire to varying degrees whether we are kicking a soccer ball, see someone else kicking a soccer ball, hear the sound of someone kicking a soccer ball, or hear or say the word kick. Not only do these amazing neurons help us learn through imitation, but in conjunction with other areas of the brain that were especially active for HSPs, they help us know others' intentions and how they feel. Hence, they are largely responsible for the universal human capacity for empathy. We do not just know how someone else feels, but actually feel that way ourselves to some extent. This is very familiar to sensitive people. Anyone's sad faces tend to generate more activity in these mirror neurons in HSPs than others. When seeing photos of their loved ones being unhappy, sensitive persons also showed more activation in areas suggesting that they wanted to do something, to act, even more than in areas involving empathy. Perhaps we learn to cool down our intense empathy in order to help. But overall, brain activation indicating empathy was stronger in HSPs than non-HSPs when looking at photos of faces showing strong emotion of any type. So what does all this mean that I just read? Essentially, the part of our brain that helps us understand and empathize with other people's feelings and experiences light up more in our brains when observing others than does the brain of a non-HSP. So there's actual evidence in our brains for why we feel so much empathy for the emotions and experiences of other people we see. Okay, that was a lot of information. Next, we're going to be getting into the serotonin and dopamine systems, so now would be a good time for a little break from absorbing the learning material if you need one. One of the most rewarding things about making the video modules in this course is seeing and hearing about how much they are helping other real-life HSPs. I'll leave a couple of my favorite comments that I've ever received from program members up on the screen here, and if you'd like, you can pause the video, take a little break, and resume the course module whenever you're ready. Okay, so now let's talk about serotonin. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that helps with mood and memory and is commonly known as the happy or feel-good chemical in the brain. Serotonin is one of those systems that behaves a little differently in our brains than non-HSPs. This is because many HSPs have the short allele genetic variation in our serotonin transporter gene, which essentially means those of us with one of the short alleles have less serotonin available. Less access to serotonin equals lower serotonin levels. Because this genetic variation in the serotonin transporter gene was found to be in many people with depression and has been associated with susceptibility to depression and anxiety, it was first considered to be a vulnerability to have this variation, that it only provided negative effects. But recently, as scientists gathered to discuss this subject within HSPs, the thinking has changed around this belief that it evolutionarily wouldn't make sense for this many people to continue to have this gene variant if it posed no positive benefits. And it's more understood now that this short allele makes us more impacted by negative and positive stimuli in the environment. meaning we are more susceptible to depression, yes, but also more susceptible to happiness and joy, all depending on the conditions of our environment, and I'd add, how we perceive them. There is a very good, well-worded quote from Psychology Today that sums this up that I want to read you. If you combine this gene with an unhealthy childhood environment, research finds you have a higher risk of depression and other disorders throughout life. But combine it with a safe, supportive environment and you get better than normal outcomes as an adult. Basically, it may boost the effects of good and bad upbringings. This gene variant of the short allele of the serotonin transporter gene has other benefits when it comes to learning and processing. And on top of being more susceptible to the conditions of our environment, good or bad, it also helps us learn from our experiences and makes us more careful decision makers. Studies have shown that people with this gene variant have been found to make better, more calculated gambling decisions. Meaning, when there is risk involved, people with the short allele of the serotonin transporter gene take their time, consider past experiences, information from the conditions of their environment, etc., to make better decisions that result in better outcomes. This might also have to do with being less motivated by external rewards and more motivated by making the right decision, which we will actually talk more about in a minute when we discuss dopamine. When HSPs were observed while gambling, they displayed more risk aversion when there was a low probability of winning, but greater risk seeking when there was a high probability of winning, longer reflection before making difficult choices, and better performance on a delayed pattern recognition task. This again, a quote from a research study. So while this variation can entail some mental health susceptibilities, like anxiety and depression, especially when we are stressed, it can also entail mental health benefits like better memory, decision-making, mental functioning, learning and processing, and more awareness of social cues. But let's talk more about this learning thing for a second. Why does having a short variation of the serotonin transporter gene help us learn more effectively? If we are more sensitive to our surroundings, including the emotions of those around us, and especially the emotions that occur within us and those around us as a result of something that has occurred, we process that information thoroughly, retain that memory, and file that experience deep in our brain, so to speak. So being more sensitive to what's going on around us can make us better learners, so as to make better, more careful, well thought out decisions in the future in relevant situations, which in most cases result as better decisions. However, in the cases when we become overly cautious, paranoid, or hypervigilant from bad past experiences, this careful decision making based on what we've learned from the past experiences can make us decide not to open up and generally be untrusting of others, etc. So, in a sense, we are highly impressionable. We integrate lessons deeply, whether they were good lessons that were learned or bad. This is again where our environment and surroundings are so important. We are going to pick up on what's going on around us, the cause and effect, and carry that with us into our future interactions, more so than someone who is not as sensitive to what's going on around them. And again, this attunement to our environment is something that can be a great asset to have when it comes to our survival. These unique neurotransmitter differences in the serotonin and dopamine systems in our brains contribute to the idea that sensory processing sensitivity is one of several diverse strategies that may help to promote survival of the species by deeper processing of environmental stimuli and better learning and memorization of associations between stimuli and emotions, so that once a situation has been encountered, the decisions and behaviors made in that moment can be retrieved and repeated in a similar future situation. This is a quote coming directly from a study done on the brain response of sensitive people to emotional pictures. So just try to remember that while our serotonin transporter gene variations may make us more susceptible to some negative outcomes, it also gives us a great deal of potential for positive outcomes and survival benefits. So now let's talk about the other neurotransmitter of significance here, dopamine. The HSP brain responds differently to the reward chemical dopamine than non-HSPs. To be more specific, the main difference lies in the dopamine receptors. The differences to how the dopamine system behaves in the HSP brain is not entirely understood yet, But scientists do understand that there are several dopamine genes that are associated with sensory processing sensitivity, and that these genes have to do with how we are motivated and also contribute to our affectedness by positive and negatives in our environment. The important thing to take away is understanding that these dopamine differences make those with sensory processing sensitivity less driven by rewards and less drawn to dopamine-inducing situations, such as competition or large social gatherings and other potentially overstimulating environments. A less dopamine-driven system means we are wired to avoid situations that would overwhelm our nervous system, which makes perfect sense for maintaining our well-being as highly sensitive people. To further clarify, I'm going to include two very well-worded quotes by writer Andre Solo of the blog Highly Sensitive Refuge. Rewards are the gold stickers of life. For example, a job promotion, a paycheck, or inclusion into a social group. Similar to introverts, HSPs are simply not as excited by the things that many others chase. This is part of what allows HSPs to hold back and be thoughtful and observant while they process information. It makes sense that someone with a sensitive system would need to feel less rewarded by external stimuli. Otherwise, you'd be constantly drawn to the same loud, busy environments that exhaust you. It would also make sense for sensitive people to feel more rewarded by positive social or emotional cues, which they are more tuned into than others in the first place. There are also some differences within the HSP brain that allow for a unique emotional experience of life, and there are three notable categories that I want to discuss: emotional vividness, emotional responsiveness, and emotional memory, which we will discuss on the next slide. These differences that I'll be discussing in these first two categories either have to do with something called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or the VMPFC, which is a brain region that isn't entirely understood yet, but is known to be involved in emotional regulation. The other one is a gene variant of norepinephrine, which is a neurotransmitter. You don't really need to know much more about what these things are or even what they do, but I will tell you what you need to know in terms of how the differences in these aspects can affect your HSP brain. Now, the following bullet points include quotes from the same two blog posts quoted previously by Andre Solo of the Highly Sensitive Refuge that discuss the HSP brain. Now, in terms of our emotional vividness, high sensitivity is linked to a gene that allows emotional enhancements to have a much greater effect on the VMPFC as it processes experiences. This norepinephrine variant turns up the dial on emotional vividness. If you haven't, you will perceive emotional aspects of the world more vividly. In terms of your emotional responsiveness, this norepinephrine variant is responsible for more activity in the parts of the brain that create internal emotional responses to your experiences. This norepinephrine gene also directly drives the level of empathy and awareness you have for others' feelings. So now let's talk about the last of the three emotional experience categories, which is emotional memory. We've already briefly mentioned that we have the benefit of our unique serotonin and dopamine systems to be able to effectively learn and store memories from past experiences. But there's even more to discuss when it comes to how our emotions are strongly bonded with our memories. The elements of our unique experience with emotional memory originate from three areas of the brain: the amygdala, which we've learned about, the hippocampus, which is involved in learning and memory, and the hypothalamus, which is involved in keeping our body's well-being in balance, like keeping our body temperature and hunger and thirst levels in a state of homeostasis. The following bullet points are from an earlier quoted research study on the brain response of sensitive people to emotional pictures. During a study of the HSP brain when viewing pictures containing positive or negative stimuli, HSPs had more brain activity than non-HSPs in the hippocampus, the area associated with emotional memory, and the hypothalamus, the area in charge of keeping homeostasis in the body. And this is a direct quote: "The hypothalamus also shows increased connectivity with emotional areas, the amygdala, and memory areas, the hippocampus, in response to emotional stimuli. These results support behavioral evidence that emotional arousal in conjunction with memory may facilitate deep processing of relevant incoming information, one of the main characteristics of sensitivity." So I know some of this stuff may be hard to understand, but essentially all you need to know is that we are wired to experience emotional aspects of life vividly, to be keenly aware of the emotions of others, to process emotional experiences in great depth, and strongly associate our emotions and our memories. With all of this emotional vividness, depth of processing, careful decision making, deep integration of what we've learned from our experiences, attention to detail in our surroundings, keen observation of other people's emotions, high alert for potential threats and danger, you better believe our minds are busy. In one brain study involving HSPs, the researchers found that the HSP's brain were still highly processing information even at rest. Another study showed a similar finding that even after experiencing something emotionally stimulating, good or bad, HSPs were still deeply processing the event after the fact. No wonder with all this increased activation in our brain and depth of processing information that we feel like our brains never really shut off. We have a powerful supercomputer up there, and even though it may get worn out and exhausted sometimes, we should give credit where credit is due. It's tired because it's working hard and doing some great work. So all of these things you experience, being mentally drained more easily, emotional vividness, being more careful to make decisions, etc., is not all in your head in the sense that you're making it up, and is all in your head in the sense that there is literal brain scan evidence backing up your experience. You can rest assured that what you are experiencing is 100% real, and there's biological and genetic proof to back you up. So that brings us to the end of part 2, all about the highly sensitive brain. Now, it's totally understandable if you didn't retain all of this information or some of it went straight over your head. All I want to make sure you take away from this module are these last bullet points, summarizing what I've just taught you. The highly sensitive brain is built to pick up on subtleties in our environment and social emotional cues. The HSP brain shows more activation during certain tasks within areas associated with perception, cognition, self-awareness, social emotions, moment-to-moment consciousness, body sensations, danger detection, readiness to act or respond to our environment, empathy, and understanding others' emotions and intentions. The HSP brain has less access to serotonin, one of the aspects that makes us more affected by the positive and negative stimuli in our environment, and makes HSPs more susceptible to depression and anxiety, but also to mental health benefits such as optimized learning, processing and memory, as well as decision making. Our brain is wired to not be as driven by dopamine and therefore is less motivated by external rewards, more motivated by positive social emotional cues, and less drawn to potentially overstimulating environments. The HSP brain has a unique experience with emotional vividness, emotional memory, and emotional responsiveness. And finally, the HSP brain processes information more deeply, during and after the event, and even at rest. Even though a lot of this information has been very scientific, I hope you've been able to make sense of a good deal of this information and that it's been helpful for you in your own self-understanding. So again, here are my 2 slides of resources that I've used to gather information for parts 1 through 3 of the HSP 101 modules. And that concludes this video in the 3-part series, so if you really enjoyed this one, I highly recommend you go check out the other 2. In my full online program where these HSP 101 modules came from, I also have additional modules on the HSP trait, as well as exercises and worksheets and journaling prompts to help you deepen your understanding and appreciation of the highly sensitive trait. And if you're interested, you can learn more about that program in the links in the description.